Okay, here we are to start week 6, I believe. This is week 6 of the Crusades, and this means we're halfway through the course, and we are going to have our midterm between now and our next lecture. So tonight I want to do, I really want to go through the Crusader States and look at all of the developments that were there, how the settlers settled in the Crusader States, how the government functioned, and what was the line of rulers, and how did the Crusader States end. And last week we were talking about a number of things. A few questions came up that we were talking about. One first question was about Pope Calixtus II, and Joni and I have both done a sort of cursory look to find out about his daughters, if he had daughters. Did you find that in Jonathan Riley Smith? No, we didn't. It wasn't there, or you didn't look?
It wasn't.
It wasn't there. Okay, I wonder if I took notes badly or something on that.
I'll look again for next
Yeah.
week.
Okay.
I can't figure out. I'll look other than in his book.
Okay. But we have taken a look, and is he saying something to me? He told me to press the mic down? You, okay. Okay. We'll look that up next time. One of the things that I had contended as we went through was that this was principally a democratic society, and some of you were not sure about that. I think that when I go through the lecture and tell you what happened and how the government was set up, and not only how it was set up, but how it functioned as the power shifted between different groups in that society, I think you'll see that it's a democracy, and I think you'll see that it was in one way a successful democracy and in another way an unsuccessful democracy. And if we have time at the end, we'll have some comments on that. Okay, I also have for you today a handout it's a genealogy of the kings and queens of Jerusalem. Now, I was not able to put this on the website, and so for those of you who are off campus, and that would be Jonathan, right? Are you here, Jonathan?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, good. Jonathan and Gary, Green Gary.
Hello, Dr. Vaughn.
Okay, Jonathan and Gary, this will be on during the break so that you can make some notes from it. And we can actually, yeah, Joni?
I'll have that couriered out to them on Friday.
We'll have it couriered out to you on Friday. Okay, that'll be good. If I can figure out how to retain the formatting, the thing is we have to turn it into an HMTL, and we lose the formatting, and you can't do a genealogy without formatting, so it's rather useless in that case. Anyway, I'll be showing it to you a number of times during the lecture tonight so that you'll see it over and over again, and I'll point out particular parts of it to you and explain how the relationships work and what's going on and some of the interesting features of it. Okay, I'm going to give you a lot of names tonight, and as you see on the genealogy, there are a lot of names. That doesn't mean you have to memorize all of them and memorize all the connections. Some are more important than others, so aim for the most important ones, and I'll try to point them out to you as we go along. Okay, then we're going to look at the Crusades, and the Crusader States, and how the Crusader States function. The Crusader, one more thing before we go on with that. Jonathan, you asked me if I could have you take the midterm on site. Where are you, Jonathan?
I'm at the Cinco campus. I emailed you. Gloria here gave me 2 names of some people that could set that up, and I gave their numbers on your email.
Oh, okay. Well, I haven't checked my email yet, so you're at Cinco. Okay, I will call them. I tried to call them actually today and didn't get an answer. not with the number you gave me, but I'll try again on Friday. And so I'll let you know on Friday. I'll email you whether or not you can have it on site. Gary, did you want it on site too?
No, ma'am, that's okay.
Okay, you can come into the campus. Okay, good.
What's
Okay.
the room number?
Can I email you that room number? Or Joni can email it to you? Yeah. We'll just do a blanket email to everyone to make sure they know what the room number is. Okay. That takes care of the exam coming up on Saturday. All right. The Crusader States were formed with the feudal institutions of Europe. And the people who came there came from a feudal background. They had the feudal institutions of lordship, vassalage, fiefs, services owed, and reciprocal rights. They began in a contract of government, and throughout the history of the Crusader States, we see them stressing those contractual relationships and the reciprocal rights that are the heart of feudalism. Many years ago, John Lamont, who was a student of Charles Homer Haskins, wrote one of the first histories of the Kingdom of Jerusalem in 1932, and he claimed that the Kingdom of Jerusalem was a model feudal state, that it was a feudal state sort of writ large. It preserved all the institutions that Europe went away from during the time that the Crusader States existed. Now, in the 70s, Joshua Prower wrote a book disagreeing with that and saying that no, it wasn't a model feudal state, and it wasn't. It didn't preserve all the archaic institutions of Europe, but rather it was like multicultural. It blended together with the institutions that were already there, and because the Holy Land, the area where the Crusader States was so different from Europe, then naturally the government had to be different. That it had to be very different in concept and in the way it functioned. Interestingly, I think both of them are right. And I'm going to sort of argue that today, that they're both right about it being an archaic feudal state and preserving the core institutions of feudalism where Europe lost them, and also that they were very, very different from Europe because they were in a much different environment than the European states were. So I'm going to sort of argue both of those concepts. The environment in which the feudal states were formed was largely urban. Now, Europe itself was largely rural. Cities had started to grow in the 1100s, and there were more and more cities were growing, and big cities like London and Paris and Bruges were getting larger and larger. But they really couldn't rival the largest cities of the Holy Land like Acre and Antioch and those cities, or even Jerusalem, in the size of those city-states. And so, in addition, the Holy Land was much more thickly populated. There were a lot more smaller cities and urban communities scattered throughout the Holy Land than there were in Europe. So really the environment was quite different. The other thing that made the environment different is Europe was totally Christian everywhere. I mean, later there were some heretics, but it was largely a Christian area. And the Holy Land was mixed. There were Jews there. There were not only Christians, but many varieties of Christians there, not just one variety as in Europe. And there were Muslims who were still there. And so it was a really different kind of an environment than Europe. The Crusaders harvested the riches of an urban mercantile culture from the cities and the ports, which were very wealthy, and the Holy Land was far more wealthy than Europe also. And the Crusaders themselves were enormously adaptable to local conditions. And here is a city of Jerusalem. It's a bas-relief from Rouen in the 15th century, but I mean, you can see that it's a true city, and Jerusalem was more than a city. It was a symbol of everything that Christians yearned for in the Holy Land. Here's Here's a chart of Jerusalem showing all the streets and the churches, most of the churches and monuments there, and the suburbs of the city. And here's a street in Jerusalem where you can see the busy markets and the towns in this very urban, multicultural environment in Jerusalem. And here to remind you are the Crusader States that we're talking about. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was set up here from this area down to here. And I've marked out some of the important cities I'm going to talk about as we go along. Here is Montreal down here in the south. I won't talk about a whole lot that's going on in the south, but here are some important places. Hebron, which is south of Jerusalem. Ascalon, which started out remaining in Muslim hands, and the Arabs of Egypt held on to Ascalon. Later on, the Crusaders got it. And going up the coast, here is Jaffa, here is Acre, and here is Tyre, Beirut, and then as we move up the coast, Damascus over here, which is one of the major capitals of the emirate, of a major emirate, the Emirate of Damascus. The assassins are over here, and this is a group of Muslims who, we'll talk about them more later, but that's where the word assassin and the concept of assassination comes from, that group. Here is St. Simeon up here, and here is Antioch here, Tarsus, and Aleppo. Okay, and we'll be talking about those as we go through today, and I'll show you this map again. Here is Smyrna with the Byzantine castle, because remember when they came into the Holy Land, it had been held by the Byzantines for many hundreds of years. And so there are lots of Byzantine castles like this. I guess you would call them castles. They were more like forts, and the Crusaders often turned them into castles. There were also Muslim mosques and Muslim fortifications in that area. Remember, it's multicultural. There's Byzantine churches all over the place. If they're not Byzantine, they're Syrian or Jacobite or one of the other sects that are in the Christian sects in that area. Here's the interior of a Byzantine church, so you can sort of get an idea of that. And here is the village of Nazareth, which has remained pretty much, you know, the way it was then up until today. This is a 19th century photograph, and even in the 19th century, this was large for the Middle Ages. This would have been a large city, and Nazareth was only a village and not that important. Well, as we saw last time, as soon as Jerusalem was conquered, they elected Godfrey of Bouillon as advocatus of Jerusalem. Baldwin was already in Edessa. His wife had died on the way to the Holy Land, and so he married an Armenian princess to get Edessa, and her family became an ally of his as he inherited the crown from his foster father. Later, he repudiated her, but he carried on conquests surrounding Edessa. Bohemond was in Antioch, and he went to Europe to call a new crusade, and there he was so famous and such a great hero that he married the daughter of the King of France at Chartres. Stephen of Blois died at about the same time that marriage took place. Raymond of St. Giles ended up in Tripoli as Count of Tripoli. Now, why was Godfrey elected? Well, that's a good question. I don't think anybody has answered that question as to why Godfrey was actually elected advocatus of Jerusalem. He refused the crown as a king. His background was he came from Lorraine and Boulogne, and everybody thinks of him as a German, as a Lorrainer, but he really wasn't. He was raised in Boulogne, which was a county right next to Flanders. It was between Normandy and Flanders in Europe, and it was much more allied with England than anybody else. I mean, really, the counts of Boulogne held a lot of land in England. They were very much involved with the English. And Godfrey's father, Eustace, had been married at one time before he married his mother, Ida, he had been married to the sister of the King of England, and so he owned enormous lands in England, and his political ties were much more with England than any place else. He did marry in Lorraine in a political match, and Godfrey ended up inheriting from his uncle Bouillon, which was a very small lordship and very unimportant, although his father and his grandfather and his great-grandfather had owned all of Upper and Lower Lorraine, which was a huge lordship. But the emperor, the German emperor, tried very hard not to give that to Godfrey, and the other claimant to the really the Duchy of Lower Lorraine was Godfrey's aunt by marriage, Matilda of Tuscany, and she fought Godfrey tooth and nail. She wasn't going to let him have anything. His uncle Godfrey the Hunchback that he inherited the lands from was married to Matilda of Tuscany, and she claimed all of that land because they died without a living child. And so the compromise that was eventually worked out, was that the emperor, the German emperor, gave him the title of Duke of Lower Lorraine without any of the lands. So he held the office, but he had none of the lands. And that's another reason why Matilda was able to challenge him for that. So he was not wealthy, and he had a very impressive background, but he was largely unsuccessful in getting the lands that he should have inherited. He didn't get them, and his mother Ida, when the crusade was called, and she helped him sell whatever he had. So he really didn't have much to go back to in Boulogne. He had lost all his lands, which is one reason he may have wanted to be advocatus of Jerusalem. He was largely undistinguished on the crusade. He didn't come from, he wasn't wealthy. He was undistinguished on the crusade. As we read through the story of the First Crusade, do you remember him doing anything particularly heroic and noticeable? I mean, he's not mentioned. And so, I mean, this is very strange that maybe it's possible that the other barons picked him for these very reasons, that he was weak and undistinguished and malleable so that they could manipulate him. And often in a democracy, that will happen. When a group of people who want power choose a leader, they will pick someone without overwhelming power so that they can retain their power. And I kind of think that's what happened. I can't prove it, but it's a theory I have. But the other lords were also either discredited or already settled or going home. And so there weren't that many actually left to choose from, to choose who would be advocatus. Now, we talked last time about the significance of the title of advocatus, that he was made on 22 July 1099, and the Latin word for that is spokesman, advocate, someone who speaks for something. That title originated in the monasteries of Europe, and the first time we run into that title, advocatus, we usually find wealthy families who have monasteries on their lands, either that are already there or that they found themselves. And that's the way they control those monasteries on their lands. They become the advocatus, or the spokesman for the monastery, and they would speak to anyone else who attempts to wrong the monastery or give it a problem. They handled the legal issues, they handled the financial issues, they handled the political issues for that monastery. And so you can see why, if he takes the title Advocatus of Jerusalem, that this would be a kind of spokesman for the rights of the city, which would be parallel to that idea of the monastery. And interestingly, later on this evolved into lawyer, that an advocatus was a lawyer. And that's what lawyers do. They speak up for the rights of people. Well, here is Matilda of Tuscany. Again, here she is. And here is Bonifacius, her father, who was Count of Tuscany before her. Okay, it was founded according to a feudal organization with the granting of lands, and here are some sample grantings of lands. So you don't have to remember these names, I'm just showing them to you here. Okay, Galdemar Carpanel, who was from Lyon in France, held the southeastern frontier. Garnier, Count of Grey in Brabant, which is in the area of Boulogne, also held lands around Nablus and north of Jerusalem. Tancred, who was from, of course, Sicily and Italy, held Bet Shean and Tiberias further north. But Godfrey of Boulogne died really soon, really fast. He died suddenly and unexpectedly, and nobody in the modern sources, nobody seems to agree on why he died or what he died of. When you looked at your sources, do any of you remember what them saying what he died of? Well, actually, I found some in the book I was using last week, the Arab accounts of the Crusades. That person had said it was a suspicious death, but the Western sources do not. They gloss over it. Modern historians tend to think that he had suffered from illness and disease and he was just weak, which may be true. But the sources don't tell us what he died of. They don't tell us why he died. I just find his death very suspicious, and I'll tell you some reasons why as we look at what he did during his reign. But his brother Baldwin succeeded him, and the succession of his brother Baldwin was not straightforward. He and Bohemond were the two candidates, and to the church Bohemond was preferable. The Lorrainers and the Flemings, however, seized Jerusalem immediately after Godfrey died, and Daimbert, who was the Patriarch of Jerusalem, and the spokesman for the legate for the Pope, was absent at the time. And here I wanted to show you where some of these lands are. Here is Nablus, and this is often also called Neapolis, and here is Tiberias, here to the north. Two of those lands that were granted out. Okay, on 20th of August, Bohemond fell into the hands of the Turks, and he was actually captured and imprisoned, and he became a romantic hero of the Muslims, and according to the chronicles, all the Muslim women sighed and swooned over how handsome and what a hero Bohemond was. Baldwin immediately saved the Principality of Antioch, and he gave his cousin Baldwin of Leborg Edessa. And this is the Baldwin of Leborg who would later become Baldwin II. Okay, so he is an important person. When Baldwin of Boulogne left Edessa to become king of Jerusalem, he gave it to this Baldwin of Leborg, and that Baldwin of Leborg became his heir to the kingdom. Between August and November, Baldwin met and made a deal with Daimbert, and we'll look at that more closely a little later. Daimbert was the papal legate and the Patriarch of Jerusalem, and in 9 November, Baldwin entered Jerusalem. On 13 November, he assumed the title of king, and on 25 December, which is Christmas Day, Daimbert crowned him King of Jerusalem in a very significant place, the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, and Tancred then became the regent of Antioch. Daimbert became the new Patriarch of Jerusalem. Okay. Here is a service in the Holy Sepulchre where you can see a service taking place here. You can see inside the church, and this is the altar here where Baldwin was crowned. The Latin Church in the Crusader States is what we're going to look at first, and how the church developed. The hierarchy of the church was set up almost immediately. There were Catholic communities settled in 3 sites in Jerusalem, at the Holy Sepulchre and at the Temple, and at St. Mary of the Valley of Jehoshaphat. In the first 80 years, there were extraordinarily ambitious and expensive building programs initiated. Greek and indigenous craftsmen were employed, and first-rate sculptors were recruited from Europe for the important facades. The wealth of building in Palestine and Syria attests to how wealthy they were and how important building in the new kingdom was. Probably there was a large-scale transfer of funds from Europe. And what is interesting about this art is it's not colonial European art, but it's a corpus of its own. It's an art style and a collection of styles alike. It's a blend of European art forms, usually in the Romanesque style, which is the old-fashioned European style, because more and more Gothic is becoming important in Europe. But in the Crusader States, the Romanesque style, the old-fashioned art, was retained, and it was blended with Byzantine and with Arabic styles. But local saints appear more and more over time, and so it diverged from European art, and it created a character of its own. Here is Jerusalem with the Church of the Nativity in the front here that you can see. I'm going to show you some close-ups of that later. And here is the plan of Jerusalem that shows where all these churches are, and I meant to look for, I think the Church of the Nativity is here, but this map is in Latin, it's very hard to read. Okay, but here is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, and you can see the outside where it has these, and this is a Crusader church. There was a church there already, but they improved it, and they put a lot of improvements and building on it. And this is quite typical of the kind of architecture that you see throughout the Holy Land, but churches were built everywhere. And here is a close-up of that entrance, if you can see the architectural details a little better in this picture. Here is the altar to the Holy Sepulchre. This is another view of it. Entrance to the Chapel of Angels leading to the tomb. Okay. And here is the Mount of Olives as seen from Jerusalem, again with a lot of buildings erected on it. They also imported Catholic clergy and monks. The Latin Church was actually formed in the 2 decades following the conquest of the Holy Land. And whenever there were vacancies for bishoprics, they appointed Catholic bishops to the existing sees, and they created new sees for the Catholic bishops. The Orthodox bishops were allowed to remain in the present sees, and the Muslims and Jews who survived were deported from Jerusalem. So Jerusalem was made a Christian city. Nevertheless, the Orthodox Patriarch of Antioch was restored to his see, and a Catholic Patriarch of Jerusalem was elected 2 weeks after the city's liberation. The Crusaders followed a policy of depopulation followed by Christian settlement. So they tried to deport everybody who was not a Christian from the area of the Holy Land. And even by 1110, which is quite early, toleration of Orthodox bishops began to break down. Well, who were the new Catholic bishops? They were chaplains of the Crusaders, and most of them were of poor quality. Adhemar of Le Puy, as you remember, had died in 1098 before Jerusalem was conquered, and so the first Catholic Patriarch of Jerusalem was elected. His name was Arnold of Choc, and he happened to be the chaplain of Robert, Duke of Normandy. The first Catholic bishop of Caesarea was Baldwin, who was the chaplain of Godfrey of Bouillon. And the Orthodox bishop of Antioch was deposed very quickly and replaced by a Catholic. The first rulers in Jerusalem had in the past supported the imperial papacy, according to Riley Smith, and that's not quite true. because Ida of Boulogne was a very close friend of Anselm of Canterbury, and Anselm was a friend of the Reformed papacy. And this is something I do research on, and I think Ida talked him into going on crusade, and that he had never supported the imperial papacy, that he really was in favor of the Reformed papacy. And so it's kind of remarkable to me that he's regarded as supporting the imperial papacy when what he did was supportive of the Reformed papacy. He called himself advocate, not king, and that supports the idea of the Pope being the ruler of Jerusalem. Most laymen seem to have had only the vaguest notion of what reform meant. And again, Riley Smith said neither Godfrey of Boulogne or Baldwin showed any sympathy for reform ideas, and I think they actually did. And Godfrey, as advocatus, shows sympathy for reform ideas. But there is now little doubt that Pope Urban had appointed Daimbert as the chief legate to replace Adhemar of Le Puy, and that implied if Godfrey of Boulogne is favoring the papacy, then that implied that he would accept Daimbert as the patriarch of Jerusalem. This is clearly what the Pope implied. In December of 1099, Daimbert headed a council that refused to confirm Arnulf of Schoch. He said he wasn't worthy, and Daimbert, of course, wanted to be the patriarch himself, and sure enough, the church elected him patriarch. He held a ceremony to invest both Godfrey and Bohemond with their realms, and the implication was that they were his vassals. And so this is a papal idea of how the church should be run as a feudal institution with the Pope at its head, and with Daimbert as the Pope's spokesman, having all the laymen as his vassals. And that's exactly what Gregory VII and the Reformers wanted. Godfrey was very short of cash, but he still invested Daimbert with the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and all its appurtenances, and later added the fourth part of Jaffa. So he was very short of cash, but he gave the lion's share of all of the church holdings, of all of the holdings of the Christians in the Holy Land, to Daimbert, the Patriarch of Jerusalem. Now, doesn't that seem to favor the Reformed papacy in the political sense, that that's what they wanted? And at Easter 1100, Daimbert forced Godfrey to cede to him the whole city of Jerusalem plus the remaining 3/4 of Jaffa. Godfrey was allowed to retain only the usufruct. Okay, the usufruct means he's holding it in tenure. And so, in effect, Daimbert holds all of Jerusalem. Now he holds all of Jaffa, the richest port in all of the area, and Godfrey only is allowed the use of it. That's a feudal concept. Godfrey's death greatly weakened Daimbert's position because Godfrey had given him so much power. Pope Paschal II sent a new legate, Maurice of Porto, now that Daimbert was patriarch, and so this strengthened the position of Daimbert as well. He had Maurice there. King Baldwin, who was crowned by Daimbert, now appealed to the legate Maurice. He accused Daimbert of crimes, engineered his suspension, and allowed him to buy back the office with stipends, and engineered his suspension. Baldwin then allowed Daimbert to buy back the office with stipends for his knights, and accused him of embezzlement and forced him into exile. In 1102, Daimbert was briefly restored, but then a trial was held, and he was tried by the papal legate, a new one, Peter of Paris, and he was deposed. And at this point, both Daimbert and Arnulf of Schoch, who you remember was the deposed first patriarch, appealed to the Pope, and the Pope hesitated on which one to confirm, so the clerics of Jerusalem elected another patriarch. So now we have 3 patriarchs claiming the office in Jerusalem. Urban, the Pope, was scandalized and chose, this is Urban III, was scandalized and chose a new legate, Ghibellin of Arles. Daimbert died on the way back to Jerusalem, and in 1108, Ghibellin declared Evremar's election invalid. Okay, Ghibellin then was elected patriarch. So we see a lot of manipulation for the office. Yeah.
Who was it that elected Ghibellin?
Okay, excellent question. I had a little statement in there that the church government mirrored the lay government. Okay, what we have is, when we have in a feudal court, you have a lord with all his council of barons who are dedicated to counsel him and give him advice, and the king or the lord has to consult those vassals before he can do anything. The church was set up in exactly the same way, so that the patriarch would have had a collection of all the clergy in Jerusalem, who would have been the bishops and the archbishops of the kingdom, and would have been the priests, but the bishops and the archbishops are the main ones who would advise them. The abbots would have advised him. And they functioned like a kind of feudal council. And the clearest parallel is the Pope with his College of Cardinals, which operates very much as the council of barons would with the king or the layman, and they are the ones who would elect then the king of the patriarch of Jerusalem. Okay, it's very political. Does it sound democratic?
It does not sound democratic. It sounds like they are confirming the Pope's appointment, and it sounds like they're saying, yes, we'll serve this choice of the Pope. It doesn't sound like they're going to contest the Pope in any way.
Yes and no. It depends on if they're reformers and if they believe that the Pope's spokesman, who would have been the legate, should rule in the name of the Pope, which without opposition. And if you had, in the case where you have both a legate, and we had that in one case when Daimbert was the patriarch and a new legate, Maurice, came in, and Maurice then deposed Daimbert. Well, if they're both spokesmen of the Pope and answerable to the Pope, you can, as Baldwin did, play one off against the other. And so the political situation allows the king to have more control over the church in that case. So the Pope is stronger if his legate is the Patriarch of Jerusalem. Yeah, question.
I'm confused now. I thought that everybody swore allegiance to the King of Constantinople. So why?
Well, they
How
did.
did the Pope? I'm confused.
Well, but they did way back on the First Crusade. They swore allegiance, but then they regarded that allegiance as broken. When, remember at the siege of Antioch, when the emperor failed to come to their rescue, I mean, he very clearly said, I'm not going to come to their rescue. I'm going to leave them to their own fate. And so at that point, most of these European lords said he broke his feudal contract. You know, he didn't save us. His feudal they would have regarded his feudal duty as coming to their rescue. And so they would regard the feudal contract that was sealed by the oath to be broken when their lord broke his end of the deal. You see, this contractual arrangement. You have to fulfill your contract or it's no longer valid under the feudal contractual relationship. So once they got to Jerusalem, they said, we are independent. We owe nothing to the emperor. Now later, they're going to appeal to the emperor as an ally when they start fighting among themselves, which they will do later on. And some of them will make alliances with the emperor and bring him in on their side. And some of them will make alliances with the emirs, the local Muslim rulers. Okay, but they'll do it for political purposes.
He's pretty much helpless in the situation. I mean, he messed up. He's got no power.
Who's helpless?
King of Constantinople.
Oh, the Emperor of Constantinople. Well, he's he's helpless in the Holy Land. I mean, he has no influence. They're going to ignore him there, and he's not strong enough to go conquer them. So he's not helpless. I mean, he's the ruler of Byzantium, and he's ruling Byzantium, which is okay, the empire. It's much shrunken up. But he doesn't have any control over the kingdom of Jerusalem. They set themselves up as independent. And now, what we're looking at here is a struggle between the king of Jerusalem and the patriarchs as to who is going to rule, whether it's going to be the Pope's representative or the local representative of the lay lords. And I'm glad you reminded me of that, because I did bring this seal of one of the patriarchs of Jerusalem. It's a later seal, and it's kind of propagandistic. Here we have a picture of the seal. We've got an angel there doing something. I think it's coming to the tomb. Okay. Yeah, I think it's the Holy Sepulchre, because this is what it says. Christ, the sepulchre, Lord of Christ, of the sepulchre of Christ is what it says, which the patriarch is calling himself. And this is the reverse side, okay, which shows him enthroned on a throne very much like a king, and he's holding a cross and holding up his fingers in blessing, 3 fingers in blessing in the Western Christian way. And it's the seal of the Patriarch William. This one happens to be William. But I mean, he's pictured like a king would be pictured. And that's the image that he's really projecting here. And this is what Daimbert was really starting in the beginning. Clearly, Baldwin, when Gibelin was elected patriarch, and you had all of them struggling over who was going to be patriarch, clearly Baldwin had outwitted this distinguished reformer Daimbert. And curiously, now at this point, Pope Paschal supported Baldwin and confirmed the assumption of the crown. I think he was sort of ratifying a fait accompli. I mean, there was nothing he could do about it but go along with it. Now Baldwin received a letter from St. Anselm, and essentially this letter said, you should rule the way a good Christian king should rule. You should not think of yourself as king, but rather a servant of the Pope and a servant of God. And so it's trying to put him in his place and tell him the right way that a king should rule. The Archbishop of Tyre also set up a kind of hierarchy with suffragan sees. He had the suffragan sees of Acre, Sidon, and Beirut, and he had part of the Patriarchate of Antioch. But Pope Paschal changed the boundaries so that Tyre lost its northern sees, trying to weaken the Archbishop of Tyre, because that would make the Archbishop of Tyre much too powerful against the Patriarch of Jerusalem. Godfrey controlled no more than 300 knights and the same number of foot soldiers when he was king. And during the time that the Holy Land was colonized by all of these Europeans, only 2,000 to 4,000 Western Europeans were in the whole Near East. In law, only the testimony of Catholics carried full weight. Non-Catholics, but Christians, were legally inferior, and Jews and Muslims had no rights at all. Okay, it was only the Christians who had any rights in the kingdom. And there were lots of other non-Catholics there who were Christians. The Maronite Church was a church that had sort of broken away from the Catholic Church in the 7th century. They were declared schismatics because during the Monophysite controversies, they accepted non-Monophysite beliefs. That Christ had 2 natures, both human and divine, and that's orthodox in the Catholic Church. But they were declared schismatics because they were monothelites. They believed that Christ had only one will, that he did not have a human will, but only a divine will. In the 7th century, they were declared schismatics. There were some other things they did differently from the Catholic Church. For one thing, they used the Syriac liturgy. For another, they had mixed convents of monks and nuns, and this was not done in the West. Their priests were also not celibate, so that they had married priests. They had a monothelite community under its own patriarchy as the Maronite Church. The Armenian Church also remained semi-independent, and it shared some of these beliefs with the Maronite Church. The Nestorians diverged most of all from the Catholic Church. They thought that God in all persons died on the cross. In other words, they sort of denied the humanity of Jesus. They didn't see Jesus as a separate person of God, but they saw Father, Son, and Holy Spirit embodied in Christ, all dying on the cross. They denied the sanctity of Mary. They said she was not a virgin and she was not the mother of God. They also inclined to the Pelagian view on free will, which was that God gave human beings complete free will to do anything they want. They could deny God if they wanted, and that is not an Orthodox belief. Let's see, they were declared heretics in the 400s, and they spread throughout Persia and eastward. There are still colonies of Nestorians in India and China, although they've diverged from these beliefs somewhat. Another group of Christians in the Holy Land were Jacobites, and they were 6th century Monophysites who believed in the single nature of Christ, that Christ was purely divine and not human. Their priests also could marry. They had monks and no nuns. So what we had in the Holy Land, I mean, I've given you a brief overview of the beliefs of these different Christians, but what we have are kind of leftovers from the development of the Christian Church that are remnants from the past of these old-fashioned beliefs that the Church had ruled were heretic or schismatic. But colonies of these people still existed in the Holy Land because they originated in the eastern part of the Church. The Orthodox hierarchies that were Byzantine continued to work alongside the Catholics. Thus, the Catholics were forced to be tolerant of other Christians because they were outnumbered. I mean, the non-Western Christians far outnumbered the Western Christians. Non-Christians suffered serious disabilities at law, but Muslims and Jews were allowed to practice their faith under the dhimmi laws. They had no really secular rights, but they were allowed to practice their faith. The Church remained largely unreformed throughout its history in the Holy Land. Proprietary churches were in the hands of laymen, and it was an old-fashioned kind of Christianity that Europe was leaping ahead and going to new developments in Christianity. The Holy Land was archaic. They held on to the archaic institutions of the Church. Proprietary churches in the hands of laymen was something the Reformers were outlawing in Europe. Kings kept a tight control of episcopal collections in the Holy Land, in the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The paradox was that it was an old-fashioned, unreformed church set up by the foremost reformers. And so the thing is, the reformers could not keep their grip on the Holy Land. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, what happened to the church. What about the secular settlements? Well, the Franks, or the Crusaders, the Westerners, settled mostly near the Eastern Christian communities, away from the Muslims. They did set up a lot of new communities, but they weren't near the Muslim communities. They chose to set up near the Christian communities. The Crusader States were not an integrated society. Some historians would like to see this as a multicultural society where they all blended together. That's not what happened. I mean, they may have had to yield to some practicalities, But by and large, the Western Crusaders, the Crusader settlers, kept themselves separate from everybody else and kept themselves powerfully in control of all the others. They kept themselves separate as a ruling class. They were not an integrated society. The Holy Land was a new frontier for Europeans, and the settlers followed in the Crusaders' footsteps. They built manor houses, settlements in the countryside in the European manner, but the lords received fiefs that were quite different from the fiefs they would have gotten in Europe. In Europe, they would have gotten a manor house, and they would have gotten land that they could farm. They would have gotten peasants to work on their land. But here in the Crusader States, they may have gotten a few of these farms or manor houses, but mostly they got money fiefs. They got collections of taxes. They got collections of fees. They got collections of rents in the city, and these are called burgages in the cities, the ports, the orchards, and farms from which they collected a cash income. And nevertheless, they were fiefs because they owed knight service. They owed military service to their lord for these money fiefs. And they enormously developed the Holy Land. They built new roads and repaired existing ones. They built bridges and mills and irrigation systems throughout, sort of developing the area. But the society they constructed was different from Europe. Largely, it was an urban society. The largely urban society resulted in the court of burgesses, which judged legal cases and dealt only with non-nobles. And so they set up a separate court for everyone who was not a noble. Now, in Europe, everything would have been judged in the Lord's court, for whom they served either as a vassal or a peasant. They would have gone to that Lord's court. Now here the society was different, so they set up the court of burgesses, dealing with non-nobles. And here is a burgess. I thought I'd let you see what a burgess would look like here. Okay. The conquerors began with feudal institutions which evolved over time to something different. They had a high court of barons that consulted and advised the king, and these were the king's major vassals who were his counselors. The high court sometimes even elected kings and passed laws and judged law cases. Whereas in Europe, kingship was growing stronger and stronger as kingdoms were centralizing and becoming part of a bureaucracy. A really centralized kind of kingship was developing, first in England, then in France, then in Germany. It didn't happen in the Holy Land, in the Kingdom of Jerusalem. It did not become a centralized bureaucracy. The High Court of Barons retained its power over the kings, and while the first kings were relatively strong, the kingship was eroded here. There was a vacillation between elective and inherited kingship that dominated politics. And another element that kept interfering in government alliances and government politics were the Venetians. Before the Crusades, the Venetians had only trading posts in different cities that carried out trade. Now the Venetians were beginning to think in terms of colonization as well as trade, and they emerged as a power element to be allied with and to be considered here. Godfrey of Boulogne was defender and advocate of the Holy Sepulchre. In Easter 1100, he did homage to the Patriarch of Jerusalem, distributed fiefs, and organized in a rough way the system of courts for the nobles and the bourgeoisie. The original code of laws was attributed to him, and that code of laws was called the Lettres des Sepulchres. The High Court, they were feudal laws, and they were very primitive in fashion. The High Court of Barons consulted and advised the king, again, a traditional feudal council of barons. The traditional feudal offices were set up, the chamberlain, the butler, the constable, the baillie, was the officer who ruled in the king's place in his absence, and we'll run into that office again and again as we go through and trace the lineage of the kings. As we saw, Godfrey of Boulogne granted Jerusalem and Jaffa to Daimbert the Patriarch, but retained the usufruct, and almost recognizing Daimbert, and by doing homage to him as his lord. But in 18 July 1100, Godfrey died of a disease. Okay, I think his death is very suspicious. A lot of other people don't, but it seems to me that the barons on the high court would not like very much him doing homage to the patriarch and giving the patriarch so much land. And I think that let's look at current at events that happen after that and see if there's any reason to follow that up. Godfrey's brother Baldwin's friends seized Jerusalem for Baldwin, and here are the partisans who seized it: Garnier de Grey, Geldemar Carpanel, Wicker l'Allemand, Geoffrey the chamberlain of the Duke, and Matthew his seneschal, Arnulf of Schoch, and Bishop Robert de Rama. All of these people put their 2 cents worth in for Baldwin, not for Bohemond, who was the rival for the throne. Godfrey's adherents considered Baldwin his heir, whether or not Godfrey had designated him. And clearly, I mean, we don't know whether Godfrey designated him, but his followers thought that Baldwin should be the heir. Later, Baldwin was thought to have inherited the throne, so there was some reason for later for supporting that position. At the time, the Patriarch Daimbert and Tancred and the Venetians were besieging Haifa, and the siege ended the 20th of August. Daimbert claimed Jerusalem on the evidence of Godfrey's grant of it to him. He sent a letter to Bohemond proclaiming him chosen heir, but Bohemond, that was at the very moment when Bohemond was captured by the Saracens, and the letter from Daimbert went astray and fell into the hands of Raymond of St. Giles, who turned it over to Baldwin. And so at that point, Bohemond never found out that he was picked by Daimbert as the chosen heir. Meanwhile, Baldwin met Maurice, the new papal legate, at Laodicea and secured his support, again playing one off against the other. And Baldwin then proceeded south to Jerusalem. On 9 November he arrived, and on 13 November he received the oaths of homage of all the barons of the city and the churchmen who had supported him. Daimbert was conspicuously absent. He retreated to Mount Zion. But between November and December 25th, Baldwin made peace with Daimbert, and on the 25th of December, Daimbert crowned Baldwin and received his homage in the Church of the Nativity at Bethlehem. And here is the Grotto of the Nativity at Bethlehem, where this ceremony seems to have taken place. Okay. Baldwin I's reign was primarily one of conquest, but he was also an active legislator. He was responsible for laws dealing with military service, confiscation of fiefs, the Assises de coup apparent, which were feudal laws. Again, bolstering the feudal construct of the government. In 1113, having put aside his Armenian wife, he married Adelaide, the widow of Roger of Sicily, who was one of the most powerful lords in all of Europe, and Adelaide brought with her a rich dowry. The marriage contract agreed that their eldest child would inherit the throne. Should there be no issue, Adelaide's son, Roger of Sicily, was to inherit. Well, the barons and Arnulf, the patriarch, were very upset about that. They didn't want Roger of Sicily, the son, to inherit. And here we can see the kingdom of Sicily is usually the kingdom of the two Sicilies. It's all of southern Italy plus Sicily, and Sicily is enormously rich on the trade routes here, and so we can see that relationship. On March 1117, however, Baldwin became sick and there were no children yet, so Arnulf, the patriarch, summoned a council of clergy and barons and proclaimed the annulment of the marriage on the grounds of consanguinity. And the marriage was annulled, and Adelaide returned to Sicily and died the following year. But Baldwin died even before she did of a fever returning from Egypt. The chief barons went to the dying king and asked him who would succeed, and he replied his brother, Eustace of Boulogne, or his nephew, Baldwin de Burgh, who was now Count of Edessa. But the accession of Baldwin de Burgh came purely as a result of election. Immediately the barons rushed into action, led by Jocelyn de Courtenay, and Jocelyn, by the way, was rewarded with the county of Edessa. And the supporters of Eustace sent word to him to come quickly if he wanted to take part in the election, but the election took place in his absence. The barons quickly elected Baldwin de Burgh, and Eustace was met in Apulia with the news of Baldwin's election, and so then he returned home to Boulogne. Baldwin de Burgh is now called Baldwin II. He was one of the strongest kings of Jerusalem. His reign of 13 years was a constant series of wars against Aleppo, Damascus, and Egypt. At the Great Council of Neapolis, which is another name for Nablus, called by the Patriarch Warmond and the king, they reformed the abuses in the church and the morals in the kingdom. The Great Council was attended by the clergy and chief nobles of the realm, and 25 articles were enacted. Among them, the enforcement, a law to enforce payment of tithes to the church, regulations concerning slavery, marriage, and other personal relationships. Ecclesiastical matters were discussed and rules adopted in a council composed largely of the lay nobility of the kingdom. Some of its provisions were issued by the kings with the consent of the barons. So this was a reform council for both church and state, which was also archaic, something that the Reformed Church had been fighting against. So these people were using old-fashioned methods of ruling. They're retaining the archaic customs of Europe. In April 1123, King Baldwin II was trying to rescue Jocelyn of Edessa from Saracen capture, and he was captured himself while campaigning near Antioch and taken into captivity by Balak of Aleppo. The barons of Jerusalem elected Eustace Grenier, lord of Caesarea and Sidon, and constable of the kingdom, to be baillie. Now, the baillie is an office that we're going to see over and over again. The baillie is a person who rules the kingdom when the king is away, or when the king is in prison, or during the king's captivity, or any time the king is not around. The baillie is a kind of regent who rules in his stead. But Grenier died the following June, and William de Burris, Prince of Galilee and Lord of Tiberias, who had succeeded Grenier in the constableship, was elected to take Grenier's place. The regency of Burris shows the degree of control over the kings by the barons, because Baldwin had asked the Venetians to assist him in the capture of Tyre, and a fleet under Domenico Michieli arrived in 1123. But the king was now captured, and here were the Venetians, so what was going to be done? Well, in the absence of the king, a treaty was made between the Patriarch Warmond, William de Burris, who is now the baillie, remember, and the Venetians. The treaty promised that the king would accept and ratify it upon his release, and no other person was to be accepted as king until King Baldwin had confirmed its terms. Upon his ransom by William de Burris, who raised all the money, Baldwin ratified the treaty in August 1124. And so that really shows the control of the barons. The Council of Barons, the High Court, really is running this government. The king doesn't have that much power. In 1128 to 30, the kingdom was troubled by the pretensions of the patriarch Stephen. Once again, Stephen attempted to revive the patriarchal suzerainty and control over the kingdom. But in 1130 he died, and his successor William caused no problems. But about this time, the question of succession came up. Baldwin had only daughters, and the desire to combine dynastic with elective claims by marrying his daughter Melisande to the man whom the barons elected as king was put forward. So they're trying to satisfy both the idea of electing a king, and they're trying to establish some concept of inheritance. Okay, so they tried to marry Melisande to the man whom the barons elected as king. Baldwin summoned a council of his barons and discussed possible candidates, and the choice fell on Fulk, Count of Anjou, who had been recommended by Count Louis VI of France and Pope Honorius II. In spring 1129, Fulk arrived at Acre and was married to Melisande, and Tyre and Acre were given to him in fief. Okay, here is Louis VI of France, Louis le Gros, who took part in this nomination. But on 21 August 1131, Baldwin died, and on his deathbed he summoned Fulk and Melisande and the chief barons and prelates. In 14 September, Fulk and Melisande were crowned in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The reign of Fulk and Melisande seems to have been a joint rule, and this is very interesting that they ruled together as king and queen. Charters were issued by Fulk with the consent of Melisande, and the name of their son Baldwin was also incorporated on occasion. And when Fulk died, Melisande retained the governance of the realm after Fulk's death, as we shall see. Their rule further increased the royal power when it approached its zenith under Fulk and Melisande. Fulk and Melisande interfered in the affairs of the counties of Antioch, Tripoli, and Edessa, and they assumed leadership in the foreign wars with Muslims that continued throughout their reign. They were successfully opposed to Zengi, the Muslim leader of Mosul, and they showed quickness in stamping out the revolt at home. When Fulk ascended the throne, he became also the Beyli of Antioch, and Bohemond II, who had married Alice, the second daughter of Baldwin II, had earlier been killed in a battle with Zengi of Mosul on January 1131. The Antiochenes had at once summoned Baldwin to assume the bailliage for his infant daughter Constance. The princess mother Alice opposed her father, but Baldwin overcame her and took over affairs. And if we want to look here at those relationships, okay, we've got Baldwin II with his daughter Melisande marrying Fulk, and the royal line goes down this way for a while. Alice married Bohemond, Prince of Antioch, and they had a daughter Constance of Antioch, who we'll run into again, and then their son is Bohemond III. His third daughter, Hodierne, married Raymond the Second and had a son, Raymond III. So those are the relationships. Okay, when Baldwin died, okay, we already looked at that. When Baldwin died the following August, Fulk was offered the bailliage by the barons, but Alice had seized the bailliage and made an alliance with Pons, Count of Tripoli, and Jocelyn of Edessa. Fulk defeated the allies and drove Alice from Antioch. She retired to Laodicea, which had been given to her by Baldwin, and Fulk retained the regency of Antioch until Constance married Raymond de Poitiers in 1136. Raymond worked closely with Fulk, assisting in the wars with Zengi. In 1132, the revolt of Hugh II de Puiset, Count of Jaffa, a cousin of Queen Melisande, broke out. He conspired with Romanus de Lepuy, the lord of Outre-Jordan. He may have been the lover of Queen Melisande, but that's probably romantic speculation. The revolt started when Hugh's stepson, Walter of Caesarea, brought charges of treason against Hugh at the king's court. Hugh did not appear and was convicted in absentia. Hugh then fortified himself in Jaffa, calling on the emir of Ascalon, a Muslim, of course, for aid. The Egyptians sent an army and attacked Arsur. Fulk beat back the Saracens and besieged Hugh. Hugh's vassals deserted him and went over to the king. The patriarch arranged a peace, and Hugh was exiled for 3 years while Fulk held Jaffa. And as Hugh never returned, his fiefs escheated to the crown. Okay, Jaffa is right here. Ascalon, which was held by the Muslims at that time, is right down here. And so this is all these battles are going right around right in here, which is very close to Jerusalem. Okay, the greater part of Fulk's reign was spent in a series of wars against the Saracens. The increasing strength of Zengi alarmed the Syrian states, both Christian and Muslim. In 1139, the alliance between Jerusalem and Damascus against the Atabeg Zengi tried to meet the force of Zengi. The Christians, meanwhile, reoccupied Banias, which had been taken from them by Zengi. In Fulk's reign, the castles of Ibelin, Blanchegard, Bersabe, and Crac were built. Extensions of the royal domain and distribution of fiefs took place, and new conquests and escheats came to the crown, new enfeoffments. Paganus the Butler in Outre-Jordan, Balian Levieux in Ibelin, Renier Bruce in Banias. And here's one of the castles he built. This is Crac de Chevalier. And here we can see a restoration of it as it was in its heyday. So in addition to all the building of churches that we already saw, there's a big campaign to build castles everywhere. In 10 November 1143, Fulk died, leaving a wife and 2 sons, Baldwin 13 and Amore, or sometimes that's spelled Amalric, 7. All of these spellings are quite irregular, and so I'm trying not to spell them too many different ways, but to stick to one spelling. Melisande now took up the governance, and they held a joint coronation of Melisande and her eldest son, Baldwin. William of Tyre says the rule was hers by right. She was remarkably well fitted to rule. There was no election this time. A dynasty was in the process of formation, so now they're stronger than the High Court, and so the kings and queens are asserting their power. Hereditary monarchy seems to have replaced elective monarchy. There was no opposition to the reign of Melisande and her son Baldwin III. Charters prove it was a joint rule and not a regency. The reign of Baldwin falls into 2 parts, before and after 1152. At first, the king and queen ruled jointly. Manasses de Herge was the chief counselor. In 1152, Baldwin rebelled against Melisande and Manasses, and the king ruled alone with a number of barons advising him. The reign of Melisande and Baldwin was a period of storm and disaster. Zengi made constant inroads on the northern counties. Edessa fell in 1144, and this stimulated the call of the Second Crusade in Europe. The forces of the Second Crusade increased the existing difficulties and stirred up new rivalries. What they did was cause a lot of trouble, and they didn't succeed in conquering the Holy Land, and we'll look at that in some detail later. It ended up plunging the kingdom into a war with Damascus and throwing Damascus into the hands of Nur ad-Din, a powerful Muslim ruler who was rising to power. Renaud de Chatillon in Antioch was embroiling himself with the Byzantine Empire as an ally. The prosperity that had existed in Fulk's reign was now ended, and depression set in, and the barons blamed Manassas as the scapegoat. And here we can see on our genealogy that Hodierne was the sister of Baldwin II, and her son was Manassas de Herge, and he is the one who had become the chief counselor who was causing all of this trouble. So he's actually related to Baldwin II. Okay, he was the son of Hodierne, sister of Baldwin II, and first cousin to Melisande. He came to the east about 1140 and was given the position of constable by Melisande and Baldwin III. On the death of Balian Dibaline, Manassas married his widow, Helvis of Ramah. Arrogance and pride antagonized the barons and the king. In 1152, the king revolted and had himself crowned again, and alone this time. He sent Walter de Saint-Omer, Prince of Galilee, and John de Soissons to Melisande with an offer to divide the kingdom. Baldwin would take Acre, Tyre, and the north. Melisande would rule Jerusalem, Neapolis or Nablus, and the south. And here is roughly the division on this map. It looks like Baldwin gets all of these counties, and Melisande gets the south, which was never very well controlled anyway. Melisande accepted, Manassas was deposed, and the constableship was conferred on Humphrey, Lord of Tauron. Queen Melisande was angered, and difficulties began, and Baldwin encroached on his mother's lands, and soon there was open warfare between them. King Baldwin was isolated Manassas in the castle of Mirabel and attacked Neapolis. Queen Melisande fled to Jerusalem and was besieged in its citadels. Many of her vassals went over to the king. Only her son Amaury, Lord of Jaffa, Philip of Neapolis, and Rohard, Viscount of Jerusalem, remained. Okay, it's time for our break, and we'll kind of pick up this story when we come back. We don't have too much here. And remember that those of you in the off-campus sites will put up the genealogy for you while during the break. Okay.